Welcome to Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield. This episode is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Call us at 719-452-4803. Here's your host, Trevor Sherry.
Thank you for joining us on Candid Conversations. We are excited to join you for yet again another setup. If you are just listening, you probably don't know what we're talking about, and that's because we started a YouTube channel.
Yep, and so this is what, our third configuration?
Yep, and I like this one better. I think we're going to stick with this.
Not as distracting.
Yeah, and today we want to talk to you about something that we've touched on here and there throughout different episodes. But we really want to hit on it today, talking about how to have difficult conversations with our kids. And we want to talk about at what point is it appropriate to talk to a kid about certain things like death or suicide or sex or a plethora of other things. What are your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I think I was going to ask you the question, what do you mean by difficult conversations? But you kind of answered that already of, these things that the world throws at us. And I know it's everybody's desire to protect our kids, right?
Yeah.
But there's that fine line of protecting our kids and totally shielding our kids from anything hard. We've talked about this quite a bit, in the past with, do we have helicopter parents? Do we have snowplow parents, or lawnmower parents, or however you want to look at it, where they're pushing every hard thing aside. But what does it mean to entrust our kids with difficult conversations, and when is it appropriate? And I don't know if we're going to give people solid answers today in the sense that every kid's going to be different, but from a development standpoint, we can talk a little bit about, when is it appropriate to have some of these conversations based on their growth.
Yeah. Right.
But it's interesting because I have a daughter who's 10 years old, and we've had some more difficult conversations just because of the line of work that I'm in and some of the things that she hears and sees when she's out, and about when I'm speaking, or when she's hearing video, seeing videos from our Who Can Relate curriculum or that kind of stuff. And so it's a good question. I think it scares a lot of parents.
Oh, absolutely. I can only imagine as my wife and I are discussing starting our family, you start thinking about things like when they're a baby, and then you start feeling the weight of, I'm going to be responsible for this human being and keeping them alive and helping them to become a functional adult.
Yep.
That's super intimidating. And I understand the hesitancy. I don't really want to talk to little kids about sex or porn or there's just so much
death or,
And yet the counselor part of me says that it's necessary. And absolutely. My wife and I have even talked about how she's a high school teacher, and a lot of her students say, I wish that I could learn about taxes and mortgage and how to pay rent and stuff like that in school. And our thought is that's really the role of the parent to teach those things. Right. And I think we've started to hand over more to schools to teach things because we don't want to as parents, like sex education.
Which we go check out our podcast on Let's Talk About Sex.
Yeah, which David was Gatlin. Excellent with David. And so I think it's easier now to pass the bill to another person. So maybe we take a brief moment to talk about why it's important that parents are the ones to not pass the bill.
It goes back to conversations that we've had in other podcasts, but that I talk about all the time, of the importance of our parents seeing their kids, right? So that the whole idea of attachment theory is being seen, having safety, being soothed, which provides security. And it's amazing what happens when you have these face-to-face, eye-to-eye conversations, right? One of our counselors, our psychologist, talks about the fact that there's a part of the brain that gets triggered or lit up when you're having these face-to-face, eye-to-eye conversations versus over text or over the phone. And it's that facial recognition that jumpstarts the emotional part of the brain and all that kind of stuff. But my question to parents is, wouldn't you want to look into your kids' eyes and kind of see how they take it or how they respond from an emotional and physiological standpoint when you're having these hard conversations versus, why don't you go to school and let them talk to you about suicide or sex or drugs? No, I want to be able to look into my kids' eyes and go, hey, this is a tough conversation.
Yeah.
But this is a serious conversation. And, as you get older, here's some things that you're going to face. But think about our society nowadays. I mean, you turn on the news and, what's the latest thing now with this, Catholic kid and, the Native American in front of Lincoln, Lincoln Memorial and based on a picture, society made a snap decision. And then if you watch the whole video, you see actually what happened. And it wasn't what, and so it's like our kids, if we're left to their own devices, and with what our society is presenting them, like, will they arrive at some of these conclusions on their own? I don't think so.
Well, and some things that I've heard recently that are really scary are a lot of teens who are self-harming started when they were 8 or so. A lot of pornography addiction begins when you're 8 or 9. And drug use. I know some of my friends in high school had started smoking and doing drugs before they were 10. And I think a lot of these conversations and some of the intimidation is we don't think it's appropriate for an 8-year-old. And yet that's when a lot of this stuff is beginning. Well,
but it needs to be age appropriate to your kid. And I think that's interesting. The longer I'm in this field of counseling, I was just talking to my wife last night going, I am just heartbroken that I've got teenagers that I'm working with that desperately have a need. I'm struggling with fill in the blank. And and they come from the outside what looks like a well adjusted family. And the kid's desire is, I just wish I had a place to share how I'm feeling so my parents would listen. And I sit back and go, well, what do you mean your parents don't listen? No, they're too busy. They don't slow down and give me the time of day. Or if I do talk to them, they kind of correct me and they don't listen. And it just breaks my heart. And I think that the biggest piece to this conversation, like you cannot have, and I'll be very blunt, you cannot have hard conversations with your kids if you've not created space for them to talk, for you to be a safe place for them to vent, or to be a place for them to explore ideas around certain things that maybe you have an opinion about, but they don't yet. And one of the biggest disservices we can do to our kids is to formulate an opinion of what they're thinking and what they believe, and not give them a voice. So before we even talk about what it means to have developmentally appropriate conversations, do you create safe places? Like the other day, I've kind of been in a funk these last couple of days, I'll admit that. And, my youngest is very verbal, and I've realized I've not been mean, but I've dismissed some of the things that she's said or wanted to do. And so I was determined the other day just to go, okay, you know what? She's 5 years old. She comes down at about 6 in the morning after I'm up for about an hour or so, and she sits on my couch in my office and just starts talking. And I usually sit at my desk and continue to work. And I'm like, no, I'm going to give her some space. So I grabbed some Chex Mix and we sat on my couch and I just let her talk. And it just allowed her the freedom and the ability just to, I don't know, we talked about anything of substance, but it was something that was important to her. And that's setting the stage when she hits 7 or 8 and we have a hard, tough conversation about whatever.
And one thing that I really, really like as a helpful tool to parents is both our episode on reflective listening that we did. And you can go to our SoundCloud or iTunes for that. And also just driving with your teenager, putting them in the passenger seat, just driving. There's something about not having to make eye contact. And if you choose to do that and just ask some open-ended questions and reflect back to them what you're hearing, it's incredible the amount of information you'll get. And even if it's not, like you said, substantial, it is information, and it's building that communication relationship, which is essential when you're having, because we mentioned in a couple episodes, you don't start the conversation about sex by talking about sex. You start it by having strong communication with your child and building up to that point, which leads us into, when does that conversation, the communication conversation, Start.
Well, but it goes back even further. When do we have conversations with our kids that are 2 or 3 years old about what do you do with the mad that you feel?
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with the sad that you feel? Some of the things we've talked about with Mr. Rogers. It's like revolutionary for a kid going, I'm feeling mad and I'm going to kick and scream. And our typical response as a parent is go to your room or, take this away or your whatever, versus going, okay, you're mad.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do with that? So so I think in a lot of ways, how do we help our kids begin to understand and explore their emotional intelligence earlier on?
Yeah.
So that when we sit down, like I sat down with my teenager, she's not a teenager yet. Good grief. Take that back. My 10-year-old.
Yeah.
And, she started asking questions about my story, and about when I was depressed or bullied and, I attempted suicide and, and I've kept it age appropriate.
Right.
I didn't talk about how I did it, or I didn't talk about, those things. I talked about more about, I was feeling really sad and I was scared and I was depressed and, what does that look like? And I needed some place to talk and I didn't have that. And, and so you create those age appropriate conversations. But here's the thing, right? I mean, and I'm sure you've seen this and I'm sure your wife has seen this too. You go see, where were we the other day? I went and saw some superhero movie. Oh, it was Aquaman. Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. I mean, although I love Jason Momoa.
It was great. Okay, that was great. Sarah, my wife, thought it was hilarious, but I was watching, and it's a pretty violent movie. Mm-hmm. Parents bringing their 4 or 5-year-olds in, and I'm like, okay, are they able to handle what's happening and process it? And no, they're not. And so I know you're in the midst of, you've done human growth and development in your time and your education process right now.
Yeah.
But we talk about the different stages of growth and development, and kids at 5 years old really can't make sense of or process through some of this more adult content of action or violence and so you're not going to have a conversation with them about certain things.
Yeah. And I'm going to post a link in the description of this episode to a video by not Frank Green. Golly, John Green.
John Green, yeah.
I was thinking Hank Green, who's his brother. And if you don't know, you may have heard of John Green's books. He's a prolific author and just a brilliant guy.
Oh, man, fantastic.
He has a show called Crash Course on YouTube.
Crash Course on everything.
Everything. It's brilliant. Super well done. But he has one on stages of development early on in life from Piaget's perspective. And I'd suggest checking it out. It's really useful information around this conversation to kind of understand if your kid is at this age and how you could find out if they've developed this sense or this ability to reason, which may help you guide some of your conversations, because it's important that they actually have a grasp of what you're talking about.
And this is where it kind of frustrates me and scares me, is that if we're following some of Piaget's stages, right, which has been kind of this foundation from education and from a lot of different things for the last 50, 60 years, we realize that the abstract thinking, so the abstract thinking and reasoning part of the brain and does not really happen until 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. So like what frustrates me is why the heck are we having conversations in our society with our kids in school about sex at 8, 9, and 10 years old when they really don't have the capacity for abstract thinking and application. And so, I mean, it baffles me that on one hand, an education system that says, here's the stages of development and here's when you have these conversations and what this looks like, is doing things earlier and earlier and earlier. I don't know. That's just my own.
And my perspective would be a little bit of, since parents aren't having those conversations as early as they may ought to be, the education system is seeing the effects of that and trying to compensate
and
overcompensate. And schools are not going to be able to have those conversations better than a parent.
No,
because
never,
it has to be I mean, you and I are able to have really good conversations on this show because we have relationship.
Right.
Not because you're my professor and I'm your student and that's the extent of our relationship. Right. And I think we miss a lot of the heart behind something. So if I'm teaching my 15-year-old about taxes as I'm going through my taxes, there's a point where I'm able to recognize, like, hey, you seem really stressed out. I am too.
Right.
Let's go take a break.
Right.
You don't have that same relational connection. And how much more important is that in a conversation about drugs than taxes?
Well, or let's go back to the sex conversation that we had with David Gavlin and the fact that, is it appropriate to teach your kids the anatomical names of the body parts?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right? Because it's, it helps with possible assault aversion, right? Because, if we know the names of our body parts, somebody tries to do something, we're able to go, no, that's not right, right? And having those conversations, but it's age appropriate.
Yeah. 3,
4, 5 years old, you're just going to, let's name the body parts.
Right. Like a finger or your tongue.
And then here's the safe, here's the safe zone, and here's the no touch zone and all that kind of stuff, right? But then when, my wife just had a conversation with our oldest, and it was more age appropriate about the beginning stages of what it means to be sexually active. And it's not something that we went into graphic detail, and it's, more of the birds and the bees conversation than anything. Right. But what it did is it opens the door for future conversations.
My dad read through a book with my 3 brothers who all were pretty close in age called Safe Images. I think something about safe images. They're talking about pornography because they were on the internet because of school or because of games. And it was important to have those conversations before they got access to that world in order to open that communication. And it was really funny one day, my brother Jackson was talking about something, and he's like, unappropriate, because that was a word that they used. Inappropriate was a word they used in the book. And so that's been a staple of our family. But just the fact that we're able to say, like, hey, what are you looking at? What did you see? Was there anything that made you feel uncomfortable, or were there any unsafe images that you saw? And it's not an accusatory or a punitive conversation at that point. It's a, hey, we care about you, and we talked about this at the very beginning, and we'll make sure you're safe, and this is why we want to keep you safe.
And that's the big thing I think that you hit on. And so, I know we're kind of talking theoretically because each family is going to be different, but it's really important that if we want to have relationship with our kids that's healthy, from throughout their lives and then into adulthood, how do we create non-judgmental zones for them to come express themselves? Because I cannot tell you how many times, and I've already said this in this podcast, where I work with teenagers and they have no safe place to go to, even on the outside that they have a somewhat normal, whatever that looks like, family. There's just no safe place to go, because if I express my opinion about this or my thought about this or my curiosity about this, it's going to get shut down and placated, or I'm going to get in trouble, or
I'm going to be shamed for it.
Or shamed for it. Obviously there's got to be boundaries in your family and and your household and that kind of stuff. But I always challenge parents, if your kid comes to you and says, hey, I tried pot yesterday and I didn't like it, but I wanted to tell you because I felt guilty, and you jump all over them. What's wrong with you? Why would you do that? Do you think they're going to come back and talk to you about something else what they're struggling with? Like, some of the biggest things I find our guys are struggling with, teenage boys, are pornography. There's that curiosity, right? That's natural.
Or even to the extent of, I feel really depressed and I want to kill myself.
Right.
That conversation won't happen if you've developed a communication system where those are going to be berated.
And so I think, for our parents listening and our listeners, whoever that might be, begin to explore these conversations with wherever your kids are at. If you've got young kids, I'm not saying, let's talk to them about drugs and they're 5 years old, or let's talk to them about,
ecstasy is a drug that,
right. Or pornography or anything like that. But how do you talk to them about, what? You know how to turn the TV on. Like, let's talk about mommy and dad can put parental controls on some of these channels so that you don't see them. And here's why. Because of safe images and safe things. You know, if you're going to, let's say you're of faith and you're going to a church, you know, like summer school or something like that, or a vacation Bible school or whatever, you know, have that conversation as you're driving up going, you know, so, you know, don't wander off by yourself. Don't go off with an adult by yourself, because here's safe people, safe, you know, and you know, when you go to the bathroom, you close the door and you lock it, and you know, and if somebody tries to, you know, and here's where you tell people, and those are age appropriate conversations.
Right.
You're not going to say, well, let's talk about human trafficking, and you know,
right.
I mean,
let's talk about how you could be taken,
right,
and I would never see you again. And, yeah, that's not.
But in essence, you're having that conversation, right? But it's age appropriate,
right?
So I think this is where parents can get, if you have, and I think too, if we can create some links, there's some great books that we use here about safe touch and you know, body parts and those kinds of things. But if you have any questions, like, feel free to reach out to us and ask us, because this is something that I think a lot of parents get freaked out about and they don't navigate. Yeah. But I mean, to be honest, it's not as hard as it sounds if you've laid the foundation for conversation, for eye contact, for connection, for validation, for, you know, all those things. It becomes a little bit easier.
And I want to end on this quick challenge of just to think about is, if you feel really uncomfortable having these conversations with your child, maybe explore why you're so uncomfortable. Is it because it's with your child, or are you uncomfortable with the topic?
Right.
And explore that for yourself, because it may be something that you grew up and you just knew, we don't talk about this, and that's stuck with you. And that's really common. And it should be explored. Even if nothing comes out of it, at least you've been able to be introspective about it.
And I think too, remember that you don't have to agree to love and accept.
Yep.
Right. So if you're in a conversation with your teenager, let's say you're listening and you're like, well, you know what, I didn't really do a very good job of setting the stage early on, but I really want to now. Yeah. Just know that you're in for an opinionated teenager, which is not a bad thing. You want your kids to have an opinion. Yeah. But it might not be yours. Yeah. And so how do you love them, accept them for being your child, even if you might not agree at that moment? And that's a tough place to navigate. Yeah. But think about the long-term effects of shame, judgment, condemnation, versus going, okay, I feel really uncomfortable right now because I don't agree with whatever you're saying, but you're my son and I love you. Yeah. And I got to figure that out myself.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, go to mayfieldcounseling.com/Candid Conversations and check out our Facebook page, Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield.